And now it is our great honor to welcome Dr. P. David Pearson, one of the foremost experts on reading, comprehension, and the Common Core State Standards. I will say that my introduction of Dr. Pearson cannot begin to convey the depth and breadth of his contributions to the field of reading. He is a faculty member and the former dean of the Graduate School of Education at UC Berkeley. He is recognized internationally as the premier scholar on reading comprehension instruction and assessment. He has received accolades and awards for his contributions by numerous literacy and education organizations, such as the International Reading Association and the Literacy Research Association. Dr. Pearson is a prolific author. He has served as editor for the Handbook of Reading Research Quarterly, and the Review of Research in Education. And most recently, actually, Dr. Pearson was a member of the Select Validation Committee for the Common Core State Standards. Dr. Pearson equips educators with research-based strategies and perspectives, and he also reminds us of the larger why behind our efforts as educators, namely that reading is ultimately a tool for the acquisition of knowledge, insight, and joy. Now I would like to turn the controls over to Dr. Pearson, and there will be just a few moments of transition as I do this, so bear with me.
There we go. I'm hoping that everyone can see my screen, and there should be a title page up that says Tasks That Teach, a seminar on reading comprehension instruction for Reading Plus. My name is David Pearson, and I'm really delighted that so many of you are willing to share some time this afternoon with me. My goal for today is to talk about these, quote, tasks that teach, and as soon as I can get my there we go. My goal today is to offer participants a model of reading comprehension development and pedagogy. We want to talk about what reading comprehension is and how we can nurture it. How do we teach it? How do we facilitate it when we're not teaching it directly? And how do we assess it? This presentation, by the way, complements one that Freddie Hebert gave a few weeks ago called Texts That Teach. And I'm hoping that we can come up with something else that can teach. So we've got texts and tasks now, and we'll be thinking of a third for you. And if you think of any, go ahead and suggest it. A word about my relationship with Reading Plus. I am an advisor to Reading Plus. What that means is that they call on me to advise them about issues of reading pedagogy, and I try to convince them of the wisdom of my ideas, just like I try to convince everyone else of the wisdom of those ideas. Whether they take my advice or not, I'll leave it up to you to make that decision. But I want to, in full disclosure, I do want to let you know that I do work as an advisor with them, and I will use some key examples from Reading Plus materials to illustrate the more general points I want to make about comprehension, curriculum, and pedagogy. And I also want to point out that nothing that I talk about today would require the exclusive use of Reading Plus in order to accomplish. That is, these are things that teachers can do in their classrooms if they have the wherewithal and the motivation to use these kinds of techniques with their students, particularly students for whom reading comprehension is not the easiest thing in the world. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. I'm going to have you read a short story, and as you read this story, I want to uncover it sort of like one line at a time. And your job is to do a kind of a silent think aloud as you listen to this story. And your job at every step along the way is to figure out what's going on in this story. Okay, here we go. Ready? Business had been slow since the latest rise in the price of crude. Now, if you're like me, I can't resist speculating about what kinds of business had been slow. And, you know, I think of what things that have something to do with oil. So it might be the car business. It might be, well, what else could it be? I suppose it could be the luxury van business, or it could be anything else that uses oil. We'll see. Nobody seemed to want anything elegant anymore. Oh, now I know it isn't just any business. It's a business that has something to do with producing things that people would call elegant. Well, I suppose that could still be cars, but it could be other elegant things. I suppose it could be like diamonds, or it could be other kinds of jewelry, or maybe furs or something like that. And maybe the people, who usually buy those things can't buy them because they don't have any money because of the rise in the price of crude. Suddenly, a well-dressed man burst through the showroom door. Oh, showroom. Now what are you thinking? Well, I'm thinking maybe still cars, but what else is in showrooms? You have showrooms for furs, you have showrooms for fancy clothes. What else do you have showrooms for? Not sure. We'll find out. And headed straight for the most expensive model on the floor. Oh, well, I don't think that we can refer to fur anymore. We don't refer to fur coats as models. So maybe I'm thinking cars. Oh, sorry. That was the directions to you. John Ingham peered over the top of his horn-rimmed glasses. John Ingham. I'm introducing a character. Now, who would be peering over the top of his horn-rimmed glasses? Not the guy bursting into the store. So, over the want ads section of the newspaper. Oh, John Ingham is reading the want ads section. This guy could be what? He could be a car salesman, and he's reading the want ads section because business is so slow, right? Adjusted his now loose-fitting jacket to hide the frayed sleeves of his shirt. Wow, times really are tough in this business, huh? And rose to meet the man. And who's the man he's meeting? Whose rhinestone stick pin and alligator boots, but were they real, seemed out of place amidst the dazzling array of steel gray. Now, who do you suppose this guy with the rhinestone stick pin and alligator boots is? He's probably the guy who burst through the showroom door, right? And he's probably thinking about buying something. And what is it that he's thinking about buying? What's going to come after the word steel gray? You're thinking, if you're like me, you're thinking some kind of car. And I'm thinking really expensive cars. And that's right, Mercedes sedans. Okay, well, we got this far. Okay, now, next one. I'll take this one, he said confidently, pointing to the most expensive model on the floor. I'm wondering right now, with this guy with his alligator boots and all this stuff, I'm wondering, if he pays for this, how's he going to pay for it? Well, if you're like me, I'm probably thinking that this guy's going to pull out a big roll of cash. And I'm thinking that this guy is also probably from, what state are you thinking? I'm thinking maybe, I don't know, somehow Texas comes to mind. Maybe Florida with the alligator boots. I don't know. I could be one of those things. Cash on the line. Yep, that's what he did. Later, the paperwork complete. John, remember who John is? That's right, he's the salesman. Muttered to himself, I'm glad I didn't blow this one. Then he added, what does he know about elegance? What does anyone know about elegance anymore? Now I learned something new about John. Not only is he out of work, and not only is he a car salesman, but he has this sort of what ironic, almost sarcastic, and sort of, I guess, complacent view of life and what's going to happen to him. And he certainly doesn't like the guy who bought the car, even though it's probably the first sale he's had in a long time. Then he smiled wryly, and as he returned to his newfound pastime, which is what? And you can all remember back and think that it's probably reading the want ads section of the paper, right? Well, what can we learn from our reading of this passage? And, I did the think aloud for you, but I'm hoping you did one on your own. I want to make several points about this. First point I want to make is that words in the text compel us as readers to invoke our knowledge to make sense out of things. You can't help but speculate about what kind of business is going on in this, even though it didn't name it explicitly. The second point is that the more unfamiliar the ideas and words in the text, the harder it is to make the link between text and knowledge. And of course, this has big implications for the kids in our charge, right? Because a lot of them, we know their knowledge repertoires don't match up with the kind of knowledge assumed in school books, right? Yet we always seek the most plausible link to knowledge that we can generate. So if you're reading along and you're reading a passage, say, about something you don't know very much about, say the sport of cricket, you'll probably, if you don't know anything about cricket, you'll invoke what? Your baseball schema to sort of figure out what's going on. And the other thing we do is we link to other parts of the text that are equally important to us. Do you notice in my Think Aloud how I kept linking back to other things that I had read earlier in the text? And that's just sort of the way that we read when we read text. We link to our knowledge, we link to other parts of the text. Well, what can we learn here again? Our internal standard for rendering text sensible is twofold. Does the meaning I assign to a word, a phrase, a sentence square with what I've read so far in the text? And does the meaning I assign, again, to a word, phrase, or sentence square with what I know to be true about the world? And those are the two essential questions that every comprehender has to act as he or she is reading. This corresponds quite nicely to the work that Walter Kinch has done in building what people in the field of psychology of reading call a construction integration model. And in a construction integration model, what we do as we read is we build a text space. And a text space is kind of a pretty faithful account of what the text says. And then we integrate the text space with our knowledge to create what psychologists call situation model, some call them a mental model, of the meaning of the text. And the mental model is not quite the same as the text space because it's now been moderated by the knowledge that we bring to the text. And then in the process of doing that, what happens to us? We learn something, so we can now go change our knowledge. It's not the same as it was 30 seconds or 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 3 days ago. And that's really this sort of construction integration process at work. Now, I have built this model that I love to use to sort of illustrate how this works. And I want you to read along with me as we give an account of this model, and we'll try it more than once so you can get yourself used to it. Out in the world are things called texts, and inside our heads are things called knowledge. Those two things work together to create this thing called the text space, which is an account of what the text says. Then we use our knowledge in conjunction with the text space to create this situation model, which accounts for what the text means. Then we feed that information back into our knowledge base, which is now changed in some fundamental way. And all the time out there in the world is this thing called experience, which is also changing our knowledge base. And then finally, once this stuff gets into our heads and is available as knowledge, that we can go out and we can do things in the world. We can act on what we know, and we can change the world in some fundamental way so that the experiences that we and other people have are never quite the same as they were before. Now, I want to go through that with you one more time just so we get all those elements straight. So we're going back to the beginning, and if you want to sort of sing along with me as we go through this, feel free to. I can't hear you, so you can sing as loudly as you like. Out in the world are things called texts. Inside our head is something called the knowledge base. The knowledge base and the text base work together to create this text space, which was sort of what the text says. The text base and the knowledge base work together to create the situation model, what the text means. Once you've figured out what the text means, then you can use that information to feed back into the knowledge base, and all the while the experience is doing its thing and changing that knowledge base too. And then finally, when we have knowledge in our heads, we can go out and change the world. There you go. That's what reading is all about. You read things so you can acquire knowledge, and that knowledge then allows you to do things in the world. And once you have more knowledge, you can understand new texts better, right? It's a kind of what I like to think of as a virtuous cycle. The more you read, the more you know, the more you know, the more you understand, the more you understand, the more you learn, the more you learn, the more you know, right? Well, what's new and different in this model? Most important is this model of the comprehension process. The text, what the author left on the page, the text base, the version the reader creates on that first faithful reading, knowledge, what you bring from prior experience, and what you have after reading, because remember, your knowledge base changes over time, and a model of meaning for the text that's dubbed the situation model, or what some people call the mental model. And this is a model, the mental model is a model that accounts for all the facts and resources available to a reader in the current situation. And what's available to the reader is what he or she has taken in from the text and what he or she already knows about. Okay? Now, what's inside that knowledge box? everything, literally everything. Your knowledge of the world, everyday stuff, including social and cultural norms, topical knowledge about things like dogs, cats, canines, all the stuff that we learn about the world. Disciplinary knowledge, how history or astronomy or mathematics works, that's all available to us in this comprehension process. But there's other kinds of knowledge too. Knowledge about how language works, knowledge about phonology and phonemic awareness and phonological awareness, and even phonics type knowledge, lexical and morphological knowledge, what we know about words and how they're related to one another and how they work, syntactic knowledge about how sentences work, genre knowledge, the different kinds of conventions we use in stories versus informational accounts versus poems versus plays and things like that. And then there's a category called pragmatics, and that's how language works in the world. It includes things like discourse or register or academic language. And what this is all about is that you don't write or talk the same way in science as you do in history, as you do in mathematics, as you do in literature. And then finally, orthography, how print relates to speech. And all these things are a part of the knowledge box. And we quite literally use all these resources when we attempt to understand what we read. Okay? That's what we know about comprehension. But how does that knowledge of comprehension square with what the new sheriff in town is saying? And by the new sheriff, I mean the Common Core State Standards. Is the theory of comprehension in the Common Core State Standards consistent with this Kinch model? Absolutely. But the mapping is a little tricky, and I want to take you through some of that. Here's the 9 anchor standards in the Common Core. We're not going to go over them in great detail. I'm sure that if you're listening to this webinar today, you've been through these 9 standards and the grade level instantiations of them more often than you like. I simply want to remind us how they're organized, and in particular, I want to focus on the 3 big categories: key ideas and details, craft and structure, and the integration of knowledge and ideas. So here's the Common Core, if just the 3 big categories: key ideas and details, craft and structure, integration of knowledge and ideas. Okay, and here's my claim. If we talk about what the text says, that's Kinch's text space, right? We talk about what the text means, that's Kinch's situation model. And we talk about what the text does, and that's what you can go out and do, and how you can sort of look at the world and even look at and analyze and critique and compare texts and things like that. That's sort of, if you will, in my metaphoric language, what the text does. And I'm claiming that that maps onto key ideas and details. Now, what the text means maps onto that last category, integration of knowledge and ideas. And I'm thinking that what the text does focuses more on craft and structure, because if you look at those 3 standards about craft and structure, they're all about the tools that authors use to try to shape our thinking as readers, right? They're all in the name of, what are the structural tools that authors use to achieve their goals, right? And try to convince us as readers of certain kinds of things. Now, by the way, I also want to point out that the NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, has 3 categories too that sort of in broad strokes correspond to these categories. They have a category called Locate and Recall, which sort of maps onto key ideas and details in the Common Core. And they have a category called Integrate and Interpret, which is more or less a mapping onto those last 3 standards of integration of knowledge and ideas. And they have one called Critique and Evaluate, which gets into things like author's craft and the relationship between structure and function in language and things like that. So it's a rough mapping. By the way, for those of you who likes to look at it all together, here's the 4 categories. My terms are says, mean, and does. Kinch's are text-based situation model, put knowledge to work. And then I map the categories from NAEP and the Common Core onto those. And by the way, this presentation will be archived and available from Reading Plus, and there's a lot of other related stuff, and I'll also put this up on my website at reading and literacy, scienceandliteracy.org, and I'll show that toward the end of the presentation. So what is, oh, and before we go on, I did want to take a minute or two to address one issue that's come up with the Common Core, and that is this close reading debate. No doubt you've run into this, and there are three questions that are really, I think, on everyone's minds. One is, so where does this close reading stuff really come from? And do we really need to discourage students from using their prior knowledge when they engage in reading comprehension and stay close to the text? And should all questions in our discussions be text dependent or text based, right? And I'm sure you've been debating that in your schools and in your district, at your district level, in workshops and the like. And so I want to give you my reading of that today too. First of all, where do they come from? Well, the first place they come from is they come from this document called the Publisher's Guidelines that David Coleman and Sue Pimentel, who were the primary authors of the ELA standards, also wrote. And this was advice to publishers on what they should do in order to make their materials Common Core compliant. And in their materials, they had certain principles that they put into the Publisher's Guidelines. And I just want to give you a few quotes from these and then talk about the implications of them. You can see here, materials make the text the focus of instruction. Avoid features that distract from the text. They should highlight the reading selections. Given the focus of the Common Core state standards, publishers should be extremely sparing in offering activities that are not text-based. Text-dependent questions do not require information or evidence from outside the text. They establish what follows and what does not follow from the text itself. And these, again, are direct quotes from the Publisher's Guidelines. Here's my concern. I think the danger is that we will operationally define text-dependent as literal factual questions, forgetting that lots of other questions and tasks are also text-reliant. Suppose that we were in a fifth grade class and we just read a chapter on westward expansion in the United States. I could imagine 3 or 4 different questions. One question I could imagine is, what were 2 reasons the pioneers moved west? Well, and if you're a smart fifth grader, you know that when you get a question like that, you go scanning through the text until you find a sentence that begins, the 2 major reasons the pioneers moved west were, and then you copy everything from there to the end of the sentence, right? And that would be an example of a literal factual question. But I could also ask the question, what does the author believe about the causes of westward expansion in the United States? And my contention is that you could go to the very same text segment and look at the same evidence to come up with an answer to this, which is very clearly an interpretive kind of question. So my point is that just because a question is interpretive doesn't mean that it's not text-based, okay? So literal and interpretive. Just as surely, I could ask the question, how valid is the claim that whoever wrote this text writes from an ideology of manifest destiny? Now, we might not ask that in our fifth grade classroom, but we might ask it in our 10th or 11th grade U.S. history classroom. And there, I've got very clearly what could be called a critical thinking kind of question. But again, the evidence that I would consult might be right there in that same place. So my point is you don't need a literal factual question to promote close reading and text dependency. This, I think, represents a fundamental misunderstanding about reading theory. Every action, critical, inferential, or literal, requires the use of prior knowledge to carry it out. We always have this interplay between what's in the text and what's in our knowledge base as we make sense of the text we read. Here's another quote from the Common Core. The Common Core state standards place a high priority on the close, sustained reading of complex text, beginning with reading standard 1. Such reading emphasizes the particular over the general and strives to focus on what lies within the 4 corners of the text. So, well, I'm not going to get into the philosophical base of where are the four corners of the text, but that would be an interesting discussion. But I think that this represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of prior knowledge and comprehension. As I tried to point out with the example that we had of, the business had been slow since the oil crisis passage, that it's the text that drags prior knowledge along, even if you don't want it to, okay? The text cries out for a schema to attach itself to. Furthermore, ideas that don't connect, they don't last long enough to allow learning to happen. They drop out of memory pretty fast. They quite literally go in one eye and out the other. And the best way to encourage learning that lasts is to connect it with as many aspects of prior knowledge as you can. And we know, in terms of models of cognition, that the more connections you can make with stuff you already know, the greater the likelihood that you will learn and remember something. So what about prior knowledge? Why has it taken such a beating in the publisher's criteria? One thought is that David Coleman and Sue Pimentel and many others like I have seen too much indulgence at the trough of prior knowledge. Too much know and not enough want to learn or learn. Too much picture walk. I've seen, first and second grade classrooms where you spend 35 minutes doing a picture walk and you have 4 minutes left to do the reading of the story. Too much story swapping about what we know about roadrunners before reading, and we never get a chance to actually read the text about roadrunners. And those kinds of things, that kind of indulgence, I think, needs to be eliminated. That is, but let's right the wrongs. We need a mid-course correction, not a pendulum swing here. We need something, I would call it a movement for knowledge in proper perspective, or a balanced view of knowledge, or knowledge in the service of understanding. That's what we need. We don't need to throw the baby of prior knowledge out with the bathwater of reading, okay? But asking kids to hold their prior knowledge at bay is like asking dogs not to bark or leaves not to fall. It's in the nature of things. Dogs bark, leaves fall, and readers use their prior knowledge to render text sensible and to figure out what to retain for later on. It's just the way things work. So what's a body to do? Well, I am a big fan of close reading, and I'm going to embrace the construct of close reading as faithfully as I can. But I want to make sure that it applies to several purposes for reading. I'm all for it applying to reading to get the flow of ideas in the piece. And if you follow the first three standards in the Common Core, that's what you'll be doing. You'll be helping figure out, helping kids figure out, what the text says, if you will. But I also know another purpose I want close reading to enhance is our knowledge base, reading to enhance our knowledge base. That's, largely standards 7, 8, and 9. And that's where we integrate our knowledge and ideas. And that's an important purpose too, but we can do close reading in the service of that. We can also read to compare with another text or body of experience or with our knowledge base. And reading to compare two texts is what? That's right, it's standard 9, I believe. And that's a really important kind of reading too. And by the way, unless we think that isn't important, to my knowledge, as I see the sample tests coming out of Park and Smarter Balance, it's clear to me that that kind of reading across text, where you compare what you learn in one text with what you learn in another, is going to be a real priority in the performance assessments parts of both Park and Smarter Balance. So it's here, and we better get ready for that. And finally, reading to critique. How good is the argument or the craft, or what is the bias in this person's perspective? That's some combination of standards 4, 5, and 6, and there's a little bit of critique in 8 in informational text, right, where we have to evaluate evidence and the like. Well, all of these approaches can be construed as interrogating the text as a primary evidentiary base. And I think what we needed to do is to develop a set of routines to activate and to enact these purposes for close reading. So that's my read on close reading. So what about all this close reading debate? Where does close reading come from? It comes from the publisher's criteria. And if you're a historian, it really comes from a movement that started in the 1920s in England and the United States called New Criticism, which is a branch of literary theory that tried to avoid attributing deep motives to authors in what they were doing in text, and wanted to deal with the text qua text. Okay, do we really need to discourage kids from using their prior knowledge? No, we can't help but use prior knowledge, but we do need to stop indulging at the trough of prior knowledge in our instructional routines and achieve greater balance. Should all questions in our discussions be text dependent? I think all questions should be motivated by the text, and they should rely on textual evidence and support. But I think we need a balance of literal, interpretive, and critical tasks. In other words, we need to balance between what measures of what the text says, means, and does. Okay? Well, now I want to deal with a little excursion into Reading Plus and how we've tried to interpret the Common Core standards in building good tasks into the curriculum that Reading Plus offers. But again, as I said at the outset, this is not something that couldn't be done in a variety of other ways, including at the school level or at the state level, or even if a teacher were so inclined, develop his or her own activities for promoting these kinds of tasks. First of all, Reading Plus has as we've analyzed things, we've really tried hard to really get into the Common Core standards. And we've got these three broad categories of core, craft, and critical questions. And we try to map those onto the Common Core standards. And our sort of general take on those is that there's standards 1 through 3 help you understand how ideas in the story are linked and getting the gist, and 4 through 6 helps you understand how and why authors organize text and use words the way they do to shape our understanding as readers. And standards 7 through 9 help you analyze, synthesize, and evaluate text. Okay. And here's sort of a kind of a more complex mapping of those. So what we've got is we've got the key ideas and details over here. And then those break down into those 3 standards, and then each of those standards has some subparts, right? So we've decomposed that big area into the 3 standards, and then to subparts of the standards, which really get at the different phrases that are offered in those anchor standards, and the same for craft and structure, and the same for integration of knowledge and ideas. Now, I wanted to show you this because people went to a lot of effort to create this this visual, but here it is in words in this same thing. This is the same approach, only we're using words to describe what goes in each of those little boxes and the like. And you can see there that there's the attempt to sort of map the standards. What we got on the left is sort of brief statements of the anchor standards, and on the right we've got the sort of the breakdown that we use in Reading Plus to try to make that happen. Okay, so that's our attempt to achieve that mapping, right? And then what we've done is we've tried, in terms of tasks, to have 4 distinct kinds of items, each of which takes care of one part of this sort of puzzle of the mapping onto the Common Core. Every time a kid reads a passage, the first question they get is some version of a main idea question, and it could be, a good title, a good summary, a main idea, and the like. And this one we ask kids to do working from their short-term memory because we don't encourage them to go back and look for the best answer, because chances are there's not going to be a place where the best answer is given. What you're going to have is sort of an assessment of what the passage is mainly about, and it looks like this. So this one is a question that the kids answer without looking back at the text. Now, question 2 is intentionally tied. Question type 2 is intentionally tied to a particular part of the text, and for this one, we try very hard to focus on either some specific information, or it could be an author's craft kinds of questions. And lots of times we use this where we'll highlight a particular part of the text and have the kid do this kind of multiple choice task. Question type 3 is where we quite intentionally want kids to compare information either across two excerpts from a given text, or it could be across two texts. And that is, this purpose is explicitly about comparison and gets at the behavior that we want to privilege in Standard 9, right, where you're comparing across texts or segments and the like. And here's how that one looks. And then finally, we've really gone out of our way to try to incorporate visual images and visual displays of information, and helping kids learn how to integrate that with text. And again, looking at a standard, what is that, standard 7, I believe. But we've focused on that, and in this one we give the kid an image and we ask them to relate it to the text, but we ask them to rely on their memory of the text, because typically, it's making a big point, not a very detailed point about the text itself. So those 4 question types then comprise our attempt to sort of traverse the territory of the Common Core and get kids engaging in really useful integrative tasks related to comprehension. Thus, the overall goal is this: provide students with a rich reading experience in which they read increasingly complex texts with increasing silent reading efficiency. I'm not talking about that aspect of the program today, but there is an emphasis on getting kids to read more efficiently with comprehension. But we always want them to read about topics that are worth learning about in their own right, and to encounter vocabulary they can use to build and name the knowledge they're acquiring, and then answer questions that stretch their comprehension repertoire across that entire range of tasks required in the Common Core, with the ultimate goal of what? Building knowledge that will enhance future comprehension activities. If you look at the preamble to the Common Core, it says right there that the goal of all this stuff is so that kids can build and acquire knowledge and insight about how the world around them works. And that we must remember is the ultimate goal of the Common Core standards. Well, what about monitoring and feedback related to comprehension performance? Here, the critical issue is finding a sensible place to stand. There's 2 problems. You can have too few skills in your system so that you don't get any diagnostically useful infrastructure, and then it's hard to help kids who need assistance. Or you can have too many skills, and then you get into a remedial quagmire, and then it's how do you ever make your way out of 39 subskills? It's just too complex a system to manage. So what we need to do is to look for what I like to call a Goldilocks solution: not too many, not too few, just right. And the solution that we came up with was to use the Common Core Anchor Standards, because it gives us 9 things to monitor and to use to guide both, initial instruction and any kind of, supplemental remedial instruction that might have to be provided. Well, why this position? Because it balances the tension between getting down to where we need to be with the specific needs of students, and also recognizing the truth about reading comprehension subskills, that they have more in common with one another than these long lists of skills might suggest. Let me just take a minute before we end to point out why this is important. The truth about comprehension subskills is that things that appear to be different from one another are actually quite similar. So, for example, I could give you main idea, theme, topic, title, summary, or synthesizing tasks, and while they're all a little different from one another, they're really variations on a common theme, and the common thing is categorizing things or events under some kind of label, right? In a main idea, we find the big idea that subsumes all the related details that go with it. A theme sort of summarizes, the actions and events and understandings about character in a story, and similarly for a summary or a synthesis. Well, what about these over here? Drawing conclusions, drawing or making inferences, detecting motives, predicting outcomes, cause and effect. You know, you could regard those as all completely different things, but what they all have in common is that you have to reason from something that's stated in a text and to draw an inference about something that's unstated. Okay, so they all emanate from the text, but require you to go outside the text to come up with a conclusion. And that's what those have in common. Now, empirically, it's true that if you, that what I've just said about things having more in common than being different, if you, they do these things in research called factor analytic studies, and let's say we began with 10 comprehension subskills, we assessed all 10, then we looked at the interrelations amongst the scores to determine how these 10 things group themselves together. And when we start off with 10, what happens to us is that we consistently find that if you start with 10, you end up with about 3. A common pattern, for example, is you get something that we could call a word meaning factor, a drawing inferences from content to prior knowledge factor, and something that might look like a utilizing text structure or attending to authorial moves to get to meaning. That's how those things come out. So again, my point is that there's no basis for having, you know, this proliferation of subskills. You know, a handful, and we think something less than 10 will serve us just fine. So my conclusion is that you need an infrastructure for teaching and monitoring comprehension, but you don't need 30 or 40. You need more than two, but you do need more than 2 or 3. And the 9 from the Common Core, because they have such you know, such purchase right now in the field, seem like a viable alternative, especially if we can sort of emphasize those 3 big clusters of comprehension tasks. So what do we do in the name of remediation? Well, you know, when you have kids who don't get it the first time through, I think you have to intervene and provide some strategy instruction. And then you have to offer modeling and guided practice on the way to independent practice. And I'll illustrate a model for doing that in just a second. In Reading Plus, our plans for the future are to try to assist teachers by providing a virtual reading coach that will help teachers help kids in this all-important journey to improve students' independent journey through understanding and learning from text. It's a tall order, but we're getting there, and we hope to be able to provide these virtual avatar coaches. And then we have this basic instructional model that I'm fond of using. This comes from the work that Nell Duke and I have done on explicit comprehension instruction. And we like to start off with an explicit description of the strategy and when and how it should be used. Then we go to this middle phase, which is a kind of a collaborative phase that includes student or teacher modeling of the strategy in action, collaboration amongst pupils or with the teacher, and guided practice where the teacher is steadily monitoring kids as she releases more and more of the responsibility for task completion to a student. And then you finally end up with independent use of the strategy. This first zone up at the top is all teacher responsibility. This middle zone here is shared responsibility, moving gradually from teacher to student. And finally, down at the bottom, we have all student responsibility. And that, as near as I can tell, is an often validated approach to helping kids become more expert at the skills and strategies they need for comprehension. Okay? So what does any good comprehension program look like? Well, it looks like this. A basic approach is to provide texts that are worth reading, scaffold students into greater efficiency, especially with silent reading, do rich vocabulary activities, some before and a lot after reading, use a full range of comprehension probes to ensure a full encounter with close reading of all types. And then you need a supplemental program, and that is when the going gets tough for a student, you have to provide extra scaffolding, coaching them on how to use strategies more effectively with that gradual release of responsibility model, and also provide extra practice on specific standards that indicate the need for improvement. So some specific remediation, but at the right grain size. And then you got to have assessment. Formative assessment for checking comprehension every day along the way, and then also stopping periodically for some sort of benchmark assessment to assess progress. Now, when you assess, if things look pretty good, then we can cycle back into that basic approach, increase the challenge both conceptually and language-wise of the text, and just sort of cycle through it. But anytime that you get a red flag in the assessment, then I think you have to cycle into that supplemental routine where we provide those kids who need it with a little extra help in getting back on the basic approach track. So in conclusion, what I want us to do in teaching reading comprehension is to move from a vicious to a virtuous cycle in student learning. And the vicious cycle we know all too well. Kids don't do well, they fail. That begets low motivation. And when your motivation is low, you don't try hard. And then what happens? That begets failure. So failure begets low motivation, begets failure, and on and on and on. And we know all too many kids in our schools who are on that vicious cycle. Let's replace it with a virtuous cycle. Knowledge begets comprehension, begets knowledge. As I said at the outset, the more you know, the more you understand, the more you understand, the more you learn, the more you learn, the more you know, and on and on and on. And that's exactly the kind of cycle of student learning that I want to invite you into today. So I want to thank you for spending time with me, and now I think I'm going to turn things back over to Jenny.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pearson. Thank you so much for what you shared with us today. And we do have just a bit of time, about 10 minutes or so, for questions. We've had some really interesting questions coming in. I will say, unfortunately, that we won't have time to answer all of them. Dr. Pearson will take some now. There were some very program-specific questions that came in about the Reading Plus program, and our staff will be happy to get back to you with answers to those later. But starting off with you, Dr. Pearson, what are the most effective strategies for struggling readers who must manage grade-level text?
Right. Well, first of all, let me say about the attempt on everyone's part to increase text complexity, just making text harder and telling people to try harder won't make it so. And I think we're in for a big surprise if we take that attitude into teaching. When you increase the challenge, you increase the obligation to provide assistance in scaffolding. So there are some things that we can do. One is to make sure that we have more than one reading for a text. And one of the things I like about what's happened with the Common Core and some of the work on close reading is that people have suggested that text should be read more than once and read from different perspectives and looking for different things. That helps. A second thing that helps, something that I like to do with kids who really struggle, is to do a kind of maybe they can read the whole thing once, and then we'll do a kind of a read-along strategy where we'll do silent reading for a few paragraphs, and every few paragraphs, I as the teacher will check in, and we'll do something like say, so what do we know now that we didn't know before, or what's the author trying to tell us in this part, and maybe a few more specific probes, but we try to sort of help them figure out how to build this situation model, sort of in progress, and we sort of work alongside of them in helping them build that situation model, and that's we just keep doing that, paragraph by paragraph. If you think back to reciprocal teaching, that's basically what reciprocal teaching tried to do, was to model and then get kids in on the act of gradually unfolding and adding to this growing situation model of what the text means. Those things help. I do think the other thing that really helps is being very explicit about some of the comprehension strategies we want kids to teach, and using that gradual release model to help them figure out how to do things and then move toward independence. And then anything you can do with struggling readers to get them to process text in a different way, like put it in some kind of chart or visual display, even act it out, things like that. Things that sort of cross modes of representation, I think, are very useful for a lot of struggling readers. So those are just a few things.
Thank you. That's great. What sorts of comprehension and vocabulary development strategies are most useful for ELL students?
Well, I believe in all of the strategies that have been documented in the work of English language learners in programs like Sheltered Workshops, SEDAI. There's several of them out there. There's one that my colleagues here in the Bay Area at WestEd have developed, and I'm just blocking on the name of it. But it's a really good program. My friend Aida Walkie does workshops on it all the time. But they emphasize a lot of scaffolding. They emphasize visualizing and visual representations of things and anything that makes the ideas that kids encounter more concrete and visceral and experiential, so that kids can connect them back to the knowledge base that they do bring, that's related as much more to their first language, is going to be helpful there. And by the way, this business of discouraging kids from using their knowledge in comprehension, I don't think it's a good idea for anyone, but it goes double for English learners. I mean, uh, these kids, when they're struggling in a language that isn't their first language, have to have something to tie these things down to, and that's got to be their experience and the like. So I think that the advice to make sure that kids can connect back to their knowledge and experience really is essential for English learners. But and the other thing I'll say is that if you read the entire list of things that are usually recommended for English learners, and then try them with kids who aren't English learners but who struggle, they'll work for them too, because they're excellent examples of really careful scaffolding on the part of teachers.
Mm, that's great to remember. Uh, what are some authentic reading tasks that teachers might utilize to prepare students for high-stakes testing?
Well, two or three thoughts. First of all, the best way you can get kids ready for high stakes assessment is to develop units on tests as a kind of a genre that,
Mm,
like stories or like essays or like arguments, you
yeah.
just got to know how to deal with it. And and if it's a regular multiple choice test with a short passage and a bunch of multiple choice questions, it is a very peculiar genre that is unique to testing, right? But testing is unfortunately a fact of life, and so I like to treat it as a genre, a specialized genre that's sort of like, I don't know, I guess what would it be like? It's kind of like, just another way of organizing information, and they tend to be these short paragraphs with lots of factoids embedded in them, so you can generate a lot of distractors. But develop a union on genre, and I think actually some people have done that. I think you can buy books out there on how to improve, how to take tests. That's one thing to do. That'll get you ready for the multiple choice parts. Teach it as if it were a form of poetry, I suppose, is what I'm saying. Although it's kind of doggerel verse, I would imagine. But with the new performance tests that are coming out in Park and Smarter Balanced, where kids are going to have to read and synthesize information across multiple texts, and they're going to have to write from those sources. They're going to have to summarize things. They're going to have to explain things, and as you get up beyond sixth grade, they're going to have to be making arguments from evidence. And so you can't do that unless you really spend a lot of time helping kids learn how to read and compare things across text to synthesize their understandings and the information they encounter across topics. So so that's really going to require new kinds of stuff. You know, it's going to push us back to uh, project-based learning that was popular, 15 or 20 years ago, and then performance assessment that was popular in the middle 90s. And so if you saved any of those from those days, it's time to dust those off and get them back into your curriculum, because it's exactly the kind of thinking and writing that's going to be emphasized on those performance tasks. And you know what? If you dusted those off and started using them again, I think the world would be a better place because anytime we can have kids engaged in tasks that emphasize understanding, the comparison and synthesis of ideas, we're going to have kids who learn and know more about the world and have more control over their place in it.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Um, so someone is curious, how might a teacher best approach the teaching of specific comprehension skills, such as inference, reasoning, or identifying author's purpose? Is that getting too granular, or would you have an answer to that?
Well, sure. That's exactly. I'm going back. I'm going back to this. That's exactly the intent that Nell Duke and our partner Strachan and Billman had when we wrote this 2011 article on supporting comprehension. Supporting kids in learning to become better comprehenders. Again, uh, explicit description of the strategy and when and how to use it, so kids know what they're supposed to do. A lot of modeling and guidance with, you know, formative assessment within this collaborative use of the strategy. A lot of guided practice where kids are doing it, but they're getting help from you and their buddies along the way. And then finally, independent use of the strategy. So this is the model, exactly the model that we, uh, suggest for teaching any particular strategy. I do want to emphasize that the research that I've read on strategy instruction suggests that other things being equal, we don't want to have long periods of time devoted to one single strategy and then go to the next one and spend another 2 weeks on the next one and the like. It's better to help kids develop a little repertoire of strategies so that you might teach, summarizing and clarifying and predicting fairly close to one another, and then enact all of them and provide, feedback on all of them. And the reason for that is that for strategies to truly be useful, you have to have this toolbox, and you got to if the only thing in your toolbox is a hammer, you'll end up pounding a lot of nails. But if you got a hammer and a saw and a wrench and a level, then maybe you can get back to maybe you can figure out which tool is best for which job.
Great. All right, Dr. Pearson, do you think we have time for one more question or?
Sure.
Okay, one more. All right, who is the lucky winner? Well, I am curious because we do often hear from teachers of middle school and high school students who are struggling readers and perhaps have motivation challenges compounding their difficulties. Are there comprehension strategies that are particularly powerful for middle school and high school students?
Well, if kids have struggled all along the way and they've gotten to middle school and high school, gotten to high school and they've probably been through, a lot of little remedial loops. So just doing the same thing over and over again isn't necessarily going to make it. I think for older kids who struggle a lot, you need to focus on the what I call the payoff strategies. I would pick paraphrasing, saying what you just read in your own words, summarizing, say what's important in your own words, but a lot fewer words, and clarifying. How do you figure out the meaning of something where on first blush you don't have a clue about how to do it? Using it in one of those models. And then finally, with struggling readers, I would really focus on high interest texts that are based upon personal interests, because you'll be amazed at how much more complicated text kids can read if the topics represent things that each of them is personally interested in. And if you can couple high interest with uh, these sort of little metacognitive routines and focus on just a few strategies like paraphrasing, summarizing, and clarifying, I think that would be the way to go with older kids. And you have to be careful how simplified the text is because they have to be high interest and they can't look like baby stuff.
Thank you. That is very helpful. All right. Well, that basically brings us to the end of our time together today. Thank you again so much, Dr. Pearson. It was such a valuable hour with you. I did want to point out here on your screen, all of you can see that you can access much more of Dr. Pearson's material at this website, scienceandliteracy.org/research/P. David Pearson. So there are many presentations and articles posted there. Um, I do want to, before I bid everyone farewell, invite you all to attend our next webinar, and that will be delivered by Dr. Ralph Radach of the Florida Center for Reading Research. He will be talking about oral versus silent reading efficiency, so an interesting research-based perspective to bring into that debate, and that will take place on Thursday, April 24th at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. So once again, thank you so much, Dr. Pearson. Thanks
And
to
can I thank
everyone who
everybody
joined.
else who joined?
Yes,
I really
please.
appreciate time is your most precious resource. Thanks for spending some with me.
Yeah. All right. Well, have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone, and thanks again.